Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the soundbites. Tonight we have a different format again, more than our usual shows. No question and answers tonight, just an informal chat about leadership change at Campaign for Vermont and here at Vote for Vermont. And with me is Ben Kinsley, who's our co-host and co-producer of the show, and will explain his change in title. And to my left is Eric Lamontagne, who's the new executive director of Campaign for Vermont.
Thank you for having me.
Come on. First time on, we'll have you on some more. This is good. So Ben, why don't you kick us off and tell us about Campaign for Vermont and maybe changes in your life?
Yeah, well, as some of our viewers may know, I am the former executive director of Campaign for Vermont. I've been involved with the organization for a number of years. And Campaign for Vermont really started out as the brainchild of Tom Pelham, Bruce Lissman, and Mary Alice McKenzie. And these three kind of got together and said, hey, we need to rethink how we're doing things in Vermont, and we need new ideas in the State House and to talk about. And they really focused on a grassroots advocacy approach. They traveled around the state and talked to a bunch of people, community leaders, business leaders, and formed this group of about 36 people. And together they said, all right, we're going to launch an organization that's going to look for good ideas where we can find them and bring those ideas to Montpelier. And that was really the genesis of Campaign for Vermont. And the organization grew very, very quickly. It was founded in 2011. By 2015, there were over 20,000 people part of the organization from all across Vermont. And there's some big initiatives behind that too. I mean, early on, they focused on ideas around government accountability and transparency, economic growth, education, which has been a huge platform for the organization. And they really worked on the grassroots organizing. I mean, when I first got involved, I was working on government accountability, ethics laws.
Right.
And also working that grassroots network, traveling around the state to events like fairs and field days, parades, all kinds of stuff, getting people engaged and getting them aware of some of the issues that are Campaign for Vermont's core issues.
Talk about the success with the ethics focus, because you really did a great job with that.
Well, and like I said, I came in to working on largely the policy platform build out. I did that for several years, working out the details of these ideas that Tom and Mary and Bruce had started with, and putting structure around them and putting research, detailed policy research around them. And the first one I worked on was ethics. You know, and you've probably heard up until last year, Vermont was one of 3 states with no ethics laws in the country. That came out of work that I did working for Campaign for Vermont, and so that's an issue that I followed for a number of years, and then had the opportunity to step up and lead the organization. And this was the thing that we put at the top priority. That we'd been talking about this. We brought it to the legislature back in 2012, and we were like, let's get this done.
That's great.
And you know, 4 years later, we got a bill through the legislature. Governor signed it last June, and you know, that was probably one of the biggest accomplishments.
And now there's an ethics committee in place, and they put out their first report recently, which we'll comment on soon.
Yeah, they've got some work to do, but you know, it's all uphill, and I know the people involved quite well in the Ethics Commission, and you know, we always said from the beginning that the Ethics Commission is a stepping stone. It's a starting point, but it's a major starting point. It's opening the door to a bigger conversation. But you know, there's other things too, as well as I think Campaign for Vermont's had a significant impact on conversations, just policy conversations around the state. Things like financial responsibility and making sure that we're meeting our obligations as a state, both to our state employees and our pension obligations, but also to our taxpayers, and making sure that we're meeting all of those obligations. And we've also had some successes in education. We were a major part of the conversation during Act 46. Or Act 46. Didn't get really what we had asked for in Act 46, and I think they're seeing some of the effects of that now. Some of the things that we'd warned them about back when that bill had passed is starting to come to. We can do a whole show on it.
Yes,
in fact.
we can. And we did now school choice.
School choice, that's another one that Campaign for Vermont has been involved in terms of raising the profile of school choice and making sure that kids who are in independent schools and have, or not just independent schools, but are on public tuitioning, have options, and that their ability to choose the right educational environment for them is something that we value, particularly in rural parts of the state.
So I couldn't find a date when Campaign for Vermont started. This is a trick question, see if you know. Do you know the date, the year?
In November of 2011.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so just for transparency's sake, I worked for Campaign for Vermont very early on. I was the chair of the Vermont GOP, and Bruce came and talked to me, and he wanted to meet with a lot of businesses.
Yeah.
So I thought of Sean Choles, who was the lobbyist for the NFIB, which is the National Federation of Independent Businesses. Is that right?
Yep, that's right.
And those two hit it off so well, and then they hired me to set up panels around the state of business people so that Bruce could have a conversation with them, and they got a great turnout and great coverage in the press.
That was
really
part
fun.
of that initial startup phase where they were trying to say, hey, we have this idea, and they were doing that kind of that fact-finding tour around the state, talking to those business owners.
What are the needs? Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, and I didn't get involved until after that. Unfortunately, I didn't get involved until I think the spring of 2012 is when I started getting involved in the organization.
People jumped at the chance just to be heard.
Right.
I thought I'd have trouble getting businesses to come talk to Bruce and a new organization. Boy, they raised their hands and they were there.
Yeah.
Anybody who wanted to listen, they were.
I remember one of the things I did early on was set up these community forums around the state. We opened it up to the public, promoted it on social media and all that stuff, and we got some really interesting debates and policy discussions with people walking off the street.
Well, Bruce is good at drawing people out anyway.
Yeah.
So let's see, about a year and a half ago, as I was doing the show for about a year before that, I decided we needed to have a bigger audience and reach out to more people. So since I was familiar with Campaign for Vermont, I wrote Ben a letter and said, hey, do you want to partner up, and maybe I could be your media arm and get the messages out? And Ben brought it to the board of directors, and they said yes. So Ben started co-hosting and co-producing with me, and we've tried to stick to the guests. I veer off every so often with some,
we've had a great group. There's a great group of guests though that we've had, and we've talked about really important issues. And I think that from Campaign for Vermont's perspective, that's the and Eric can talk more to this in a minute here, but the real value is those policy discussions, and there really is no other format in Vermont where you're having an hour-long conversation about meaningful policy issues.
Well, that's the focus, and the tagline is listening beyond the sound bites, because generally speaking in Vermont, you only hear sound bites and not so much both sides of the story, so we tried to bring the other side. And it's nonpartisan, and we let our guests talk, and we've had a variety of guests from different parties and different nonprofits and
different sides of issues.
Different sides of issues. We've had some debates, so that's good.
Those are always fun.
So anyway, just a matter of time here, I'm going to have to let poor Eric talk here. See, I told you, we just get started. So could you talk a little bit about yourself and why you decided to leave Campaign for Vermont?
Right, yeah, so it was an interesting experience finally getting that ethics legislation through last spring. And we were in the process of looking at what the next steps for the organization were going to be and what our long-term plan was, because quite honestly, the ethics was our major focal point for a while, and then we were looking at, okay, what is our next big issue going to be? And then I ended up having an opportunity come up with a local Vermont company that was a really great opportunity. And I decided it was a good time for me to transition because, Campaign for Vermont, I've been working with the organization for a number of years at that point, and I had this other opportunity come up, and the timing was right. And I think I felt like I walked away with a sense of accomplishment doing what I did and seeing the ethics issue through, and
But
so
you couldn't leave the show, could you?
I couldn't, and I'm still involved. I talk with Eric quite regularly, and I'm still involved in the organization wherever I can because I do believe in the mission and the goals.
So Ben left, and enter Eric Lamontagne. I said it right.
You did.
I wrote it out exactly how it sounds, so I could do that. Could you tell us about your role at the Campaign for Vermont and this amazing action plan you put together, which I'm very excited about?
Yeah, I'm extremely excited to be involved with Campaign for Vermont. I've known about Campaign for Vermont for several years prior to my direct involvement. I was one of the original people who put their name on the partner list on the website back in when they first started up in 2011, 2012-ish. So I've been paying attention to the organization for quite some time. Back this fall, a similar situation happened for me with Ben, where I had been in a position for close to 7 years, a different role for close to 7 years, and it was just time to. I'd started that job when I was 23, and thank goodness I'm not 23 anymore. And it was just time to explore something else. And I happened to call Ben for something completely different.
Yeah.
And he mentioned that they were looking for somebody to come on and help with some fundraising and some PR and outreach. Right. So I started working there for doing that role for a few months, and then once Ben decided to make his transition, I was asked to step up to the plate and take on some new initiatives and start planning out and really implementing the next steps. Ethics was a huge accomplishment. As Ben said, it was a foundation. We would have liked to have seen it go through stronger, but you do have to start somewhere. And again, once it's a lot easier to build the house once you have the foundation down.
A few words.
Exactly, and there was some mandatory reporting inside that ethics bill that went through. So we know we're going to be revisiting this issue next year. That was part of that report that came out from the Ethics Commission this spring. So it's an ongoing thing for sure.
That's great. So tell us about that action plan of yours,
so I'm a born and raised Vermonter, small town Vermonter, North Thetford, one of those towns.
That's full.
There's really no reason to know it unless you're there. It's I loved it. Loved growing up there. My father was a landscaper at a small landscaping company, so I learned to drive by plowing driveways with him in the winter. And so, having had that Vermont Vermont experience and being the first generation of my family to go to college and to graduate from college, I really appreciate what Campaign for Vermont is doing, where they're looking to focus on the prosperity of all Vermonters from all backgrounds and from all walks of life. That's really important to me. Right. So one of the first things that I did was create an action plan. If an organization is going to take those next steps and tackle those next initiatives, we need some guiding principles and some guiding language for that. So working with the board of directors, we created what we call the 3 E's of prosperity: education, economics, and ethics. 3 very, very important issues that we have to tackle with a sense of, while prioritizing accountability and transparency. We have to tackle these initiatives if we really want to see our state grow and see our state thrive and see our state continue to be a place that people can prosper and they can build a life here. There's so many challenges to being a Vermonter now. The cost of living is astronomical. It's really difficult to start a business here. There's things that we have to do now if we want to make sure that, when I have kids, I would love to raise my kids in Vermont, but I want to make sure that the state is a place where I can raise them, where they have a quality education system, where they have an engaged political system, where it's not just politicians doing whatever they feel like doing, but rather an actual open dialogue between the voters and the elected officials. I want to make sure that my kid can get a summer job. when the time comes,
Right.
that's available to them, that they have very good, those educational choices through school choice system. So I'm very, very excited to be working on some of these. So the action plan that we came up with really focuses in two areas: advocacy priorities and programmatic objectives. So for advocacy priorities, it's continuing to push for those three E's: education, economics, and ethics. Believing that education financing needs to be a priority, it needs to be accountable, it needs to be transparent, and it needs to be done in a way that allows a high standard at the same time. Right now we're spending $1.6 billion to educate 78,000 K through 12 students. That number is going to be going down over the next 5 years. They expect 9,000 fewer students to be in the Vermont school system, but they're also projecting those costs to go up.
Right.
That's not
staggering.
That's not the trend that we need to. That's not a sustainable trend. We need to address this. Economics, again, it's making sure that we're tackling tax policy in a way, and not just tax policy, but any of these policies that tie into money in a way that's not just necessarily what might feel good, but what actually the data supports is the right move for the state.
Right.
And that's something that's very personally important to me, is that any policy, regardless what it's pertaining to, policy needs to be based in fact.
Right.
It needs to be based in logic, and we've seen this with some of the bills that are affecting independent schools, where these bills on paper look really good, but when you really dig into what's behind the bills, it was going to be detrimental to school choice. Right. It was going to be harmful to just being able to create that. Essentially, the bill was pitting independent schools against public schools, which wasn't the case. So it's making sure that when we put through these policies, that it's based on not just what looks good on paper, but what are the real world implications of these things.
Well, and I think Act 46 is a good example of that, because Act 46 seemed logical, right? Where you can force some of these schools to consolidate, you get less duplication of services. But if you look at the data, and we did a report on this in 2014, the data doesn't support that. In fact, on average, larger districts spend more per student than smaller districts do. And I think that the logic kind of broke down there. One of the reasons where that common sense logic maybe broke down was that we had already pushed all of those services up to the supervisory union level. Right. So all of those savings you would have seen from consolidating school districts were already being realized, because those savings were already being saved at the supervisory union level. Yeah. So one of the things we had talked about back then was we should be looking at supervisory unions. We have 62 of them in Vermont. There's no reason we need 62 supervisory unions, and that's where all the money is, because we've already pushed bulk buying, we pushed special ed, all of that stuff was at the SU level, even back then.
And that's a great example of the organization's approach to policy proposals, is looking at things, trying to break that paradigm that we have, and looking at these issues, approaching them with a different look, and a look that's really rooted in numbers and in data.
I was going to say, Ben mentioned data, and I think everything you put out, that Campaign for Vermont puts out, both of you, it's always rooted in data that you can turn around and say, here's the numbers to prove what's being said.
And I'll tell you where that culture came from. That was totally Tom Pelham.
Oh, I bet
was
you.
always saying, show me the numbers. I want to see the numbers. I want to see how this works. And that is stuck with the organization.
Rightly it should. It should stick with the legislature too while they're at it.
And I just want to say as well that one of the main things that we need to focus on too is, just as a state, and one of our major programmatic objectives is going to be kind of continuing with some of the things that Ben did, which was giving the opportunity for voters to engage in their politics in a meaningful way. We have such a disenfranchisement between this disconnect between the voters and the officials and voters are saying, well, why would I even bother engaging? Nothing I say matters. Right. It shouldn't be that way, and we need to come up with ways to fix that and give the power back to the people so that they feel like they're going to be heard.
Well, and actually to that point, I think that we live in a really interesting time period right at the moment. At this moment in time, we've seen so many examples over the last 18 months of people standing up and making change. Yeah. And I think that's inspiring. I mean, everything from the Me Too movement to the kids in Florida who stood up and said
respectfully,
respectful, right? Yes. But and regardless of where you stand on that issue, that you can point to that and say people stood up, and said we want to change something, and they changed it.
And it worked.
Right.
Yeah. So I need to interject here. Somewhere, when you came on board, Louise McCarran, who was the former president of the board of directors, had been there for quite a few years, and thank you, Louise, for your service. She decided to step down, and because of my relationship with Campaign for Vermont, I was asked to be president, and I must say it didn't take me very long to say yes. So
I didn't push you at all to say
exactly. Yes. I just signed right up. And one thing we didn't talk about, which I'd like, there's a couple things I want to look at this summer to be ready for next legislation, is technical centers. The new workforce development bill really focuses in several cases on tech centers, and it's like, thank you. Yeah. Finally, they're paying attention to tech centers. And another thing that we cover a lot on this show is the Lake Champlain cleanup. Yeah. And we have some ideas that we'd like to research and get the data on and propose to the legislature. And of course, the old school property tax. I think they're looking right now at the last week, 58 million. Is that the latest number?
It's 44 million.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's only 44 million.
44 million is the deficit. Most of that is self-imposed by the legislature.
No, they're looking to increase taxes. There was a big article today about
it's a function of several things, because the only thing that doesn't change or that's variable, that goes into the education fund, is property taxes. Right. So if you change any of the other funding sources, the only thing that can adjust to meet the revenue demand is the property tax piece. Right.
Well, they switch back and forth between income tax, property tax. I mean, this was quite the circus this year.
Well, they were expecting it to be more like an $80 million gap going into this year. The school budgets actually came in about half of what they were expecting, half the increase of what they were expecting. They were looking at a 3.2% increase, and they actually came back at a 1.6.
And yet property taxes are going up. Right?
And they're going up, but actually the point to make there is that 3/4 of that increase was all due to the legislature's use of one-time funds. Yeah, which is kind of funny, because that's what they're pointing back at the governor, saying you're going to fix this with one-time funds, when they created the problem with one-time funds.
I think a lot of our problems started when we had all the funding after Irene for the projects, the one-time funding. We just built this unrealistic expectation of funds.
Yeah. Well, and that's it. That's what we're seeing a lot of, is this: we're not coming up with real, true solutions. Right. We're kicking the can. We have these kick the can politics that are going on, where we're using these one-time funds instead of coming up with true solutions. We're finding this issue where we're facing the same problems year after year after year, and Vermonters are getting sick of it, because we're not really focusing on true solutions.
Yes, and even though the governor did a wonderful thing by not raising taxes last year and hopefully this year, it doesn't change our place in the tax bracket, because you've got to lower the taxes, not increase them and keep them the same.
Well, and I mean, everyone talks about property taxes, because that's the one that tends to change from year to year, right? So that's, you get a higher bill every year. That's pretty typical. Your income tax bracket usually doesn't change a whole lot, so you're paying around the same every year, or you're paying a little more if you have a little higher income. The property taxes are the ones that everyone are concerned about. Right. And there's solutions there, and the H911, which is a bill that I know Campaign for Vermont's been following. There were some solutions to that in there, in terms of dedicating certain revenue sources to the education fund, so that those will hopefully grow in a similar fashion. Right. But yeah, I mean, the reality is that this property tax increase is a creature of the legislature. If you look at the last 3 years, the school boards have level funded. I mean, they have not increased their spending
I know.
in any meaningful way in the last 3 years. This increase really is all due to the legislature pulling dollars out of the ed fund to spend elsewhere.
Right.
And so
Do you hear that, folks?
it's their issue to solve. And,
Yes.
and if you solve that with this one-time money that the governor's talking about, maybe you make that part of the general fund transfer ongoing so you don't have a structural deficit next year.
Yep.
So this sounds like a whole show on its own.
No, well, exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe for something to do for the summer.
Yeah.
Tell folks how they can sign up, because every Monday you put out a summary of what's been happening and what we think about it.
Yeah, so communicating to the Vermonters, again, going back to that whole issue of connecting Vermonters with their politics, the role that we want to play is to communicate to Vermonters exactly what's going on. We're a small organization. We only have the capacity to follow certain issues. It's actually one of the great roles that this show plays, is if there's an issue that we as an organization can't get really behind, just because we don't have the capacity to, that's when people can come on and use in the show. They can talk about it, and then the viewers of the show can kind of draw their own opinions. But I am trying to send out at least weekly updates on what's going on. Once the session is over, that'll move a little bit more into our policy initiatives. As you alluded to, we're going to be looking at some creative ways to address some of the water quality funding, which is this enormous issue that's vital to the economy of Vermont that we have to find a way to tackle. We're going to really be focusing on those workforce development bills and trying to make sure that we can support people and support students no matter what education path they want to. And I mean, Vermont is in a dire need of skilled labor right now. And then also continuing to push this really creative international tuitioning students initiative. That was something created from Ben.
I got such compliments today at a meeting I was at from two of the people that want to see us really push that concept. They think it's the greatest thing.
That there's so much potential with that idea to both help support and fund local schools while also contributing to the diversity in our schools in a way that works within the capacity of the school itself. So there's really no downside that I can see.
It's a great idea.
Yeah,
so you guys will all be hearing more about that.
Yes, right.
Some great potential. There's a number of solutions, and I think part of what Campaign for Vermont does really well is looking at problems and seeing how we can turn those issues into an asset and turning that paradigm on its head.
So Eric and I are going to go hit a few of the TV shows up in the next couple of weeks, and radio shows, Bill Sayers. So I hope you will sign up. What's the website? Do you know it offhand?
It's just campaignforvermont.org. The Facebook page gets updated quite frequently as well. We try to do every other day at least on the Campaign for Vermont Facebook page.
Stay tuned. And we would love to hear from you if you have any ideas of what you'd like us to weigh in on. You'll be hearing from us over the summer and for sure before the legislature kicks off. Ben, thank you for all the work you've done for the organization. Eric, looking forward to working with you. We're looking to expand our board and our advisory committee, which we'll tap for technical advice. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.